I spent 4 years bathing, feeding, and burying my father while my brother sent flowers. Then he sued me, claiming I stole the trust. He wanted everything. What my lawyer pulled from a sealed envelope in that courtroom changed all of it. Before we get back to today's story, I have some exciting news to share. We have officially launched a brand new channel called Layer of Lies. Over there, we are dedicating our platform to bringing you the most satisfying, jaw-dropping corporate revenge stories on the internet. We're diving deep into cutthroat office politics, backstabbing bosses, toxic coworkers, and the incredible women who turned the tables and came out on top. Grab your coffee, because we are serving all the boardroom drama with full context, community reactions, and top-tier narration that brings every power move to life. Make sure to subscribe to Layer of Lies right now so you don't miss out. You'll find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag. Thank you for your continued support as we grow this community. Now, back to the story. The saw was still spinning when the man in the gray suit walked into my workshop. I remember that detail more clearly than almost anything else about that Tuesday morning, because a spinning saw is the one thing in my shop I never take my eyes off. You learn that fast in my trade, or you learn it slow and pay for the lesson with a finger. I had a length of quarter-sawn white oak feeding through the blade, a replacement rail for a 1910 library table that a client 3 towns over had been waiting on for a month, and I did not stop the cut. I finished it. I killed the motor. I lifted my safety glasses up onto my forehead, and only then did I look at the stranger standing just inside my roll-up door, holding a manila envelope the way people hold things they'd rather not be holding. "Emma Scott," he asked. "That's me." He crossed the sawdust floor, and I noticed he stepped carefully, the way people do in a place they don't understand, like the floor itself might do something to them. He held the envelope out. When I didn't take it fast enough, he set it on my workbench, right on top of the little brass carpenter's level my father had given me 30 years before. "You've been served," he said, not unkindly. He'd probably said it 1,000 times. "Have a good day, ma'am." Then he was gone, and I was standing alone in a workshop that suddenly felt very cold for June, staring at an envelope I already knew I didn't want to open. Let me back up and tell you who I am, because it matters for everything that comes after. My name is Emma Scott. I was 46 years old that summer, divorced for 9 years, mother to a 15-year-old girl named Lily who was, at that exact moment, at her summer job scooping ice cream, and blessedly unaware that our lives were about to be dragged through a courtroom. I restore furniture for a living. Antique pieces mostly, the ones with dovetail joints cut by hand 100 years ago, the ones with a story in every scratch. I also do millwork for historic homes, crown molding and staircases and window casings that have to match wood nobody manufactures anymore. It's slow work. It doesn't make me rich, but it's honest, and it's mine, and I'm good at it. I learned all of it from my father. Thomas Scott was a carpenter for 51 years, and he was the finest man I ever knew. My mother, Helen, passed when I was 32, a heart attack, sudden, cruel, over before any of us could say the things you're supposed to say. After that, it was just Dad. And for the last 4 years of his life, when the Parkinson's took his hands first and then his legs and finally, near the end, his voice, it was just Dad and me, not Dad and Ryan. My brother lived 2,000 miles away in Arizona, and in 4 years he came home twice. Once for 3 days at Christmas, once for the funeral. I picked up the envelope. I slid the brass level out from underneath it and set the little tool aside, and I swear to you my hands were steadier holding that level than they were holding the papers. I opened the flap. I read the caption at the top of the first page, and the words rearranged themselves twice before they'd hold still long enough to make sense. Ryan Scott, plaintiff, v. Emma Scott, defendant. Petition to set aside trust. Claim of undue influence. Undue influence. My brother was telling a court that I had manipulated a dying man, our father, into leaving me things I hadn't earned. That I had, essentially, stolen from a corpse. I set the papers down on the bench very carefully, the way you set down something that might explode, and I looked at the brass level sitting in the sawdust, And I thought about my father's hands folded on his chest in a hospital bed, and I understood that grief has a second floor most people never have to visit. There's the floor where you lose the person. And then there's the floor below it, the one you fall through, where someone you loved tells the whole world that your love was a con. I didn't cry that first day. That surprised me later when I had time to think about it. I think I was too stunned to cry, the way you don't feel the cut right away when the chisel slips. You just see the blood and think, that's mine. I called Ryan. Of course I did. He was my brother. We'd built forts together in the backyard, we'd covered for each other with our parents, he'd taught me to ride a bike by running behind me and lying about when he let go. Some part of me was still convinced this was a mistake, a lawyer being overzealous, a misunderstanding I could clear up in one phone call the way I'd cleared up 100 childhood squabbles. He didn't pick up. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and his voice on the recording was so ordinary, so much my brother's voice, that my throat closed. I hung up without leaving a message. I texted instead. Ryan, I just got served with a lawsuit. From you, what is going on? Please call me. This has to be a mistake. The 3 dots appeared. They pulsed for a long time, long enough that I could picture him typing and deleting, typing and deleting. And then the reply came, and it wasn't from the brother I knew at all. It was flat. Legal. Rehearsed. Emma, I've been advised not to communicate with you directly. All communication should go through my representative. You'll be hearing from Becca Vance. Please respect the process. My representative, who talks like that about their own sister. I read it 4 times. Becca Vance, I didn't know the name. I would come to know it very well. That night, after Lily was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of tea I never drank, and I let myself go back through the last 4 years the way you'd walk through a house checking every lock. I wanted to find the room where I'd done something wrong, because if Ryan believed this, maybe there was a room. Maybe I'd missed something. I thought about the mornings. God, the mornings. Getting Dad up, which near the end took 40 minutes and both of us sweating. The pills, 11 of them, on a schedule so precise that I'd taped it to the inside of the medicine cabinet and set 3 alarms. The doctor's appointments I'd driven him to, 45 minutes each way, in a truck that smelled like sawdust and old man, because those were the 2 smells that made up my whole world. The nights he'd call out, disoriented, thinking my mother was still alive, thinking it was 1985, and I'd sit on the edge of his bed and hold his shaking hand and say, I'm here, Dad, it's Emma, I'm here, until he came back to himself. I thought about my business, which I'd let shrink to almost nothing because you cannot restore a federal period highboy and also be on call 24 hours for a man who might fall. I thought about the money I'd spent, my money, from my thinning savings, on the ramp for the porch, on the shower chair, on the caregiver I hired for the 12 hours a week I absolutely had to be at the shop or lose every client I had left. And I thought about Ryan's contribution to all of it, which was flowers. Genuinely. Twice a year, a floral arrangement would arrive with a card in the florist's handwriting, and Dad would look at it and say, "Is that from your brother?" And I'd say yes, and he'd nod, and something in his face would go quiet and old. There was one more thing I kept circling back to, and I didn't understand yet why my mind wouldn't let it go. It was the brass level. My father's carpenter's level, the little brass one worn smooth from 60 years of his hands. He'd given it to me when I was 16 and made my first real joint, and he'd said something I never forgot. He'd said, "The bubble never lies, Em. People do. Wood does, it'll cup and warp and lie to you about being flat, but the bubble tells you the truth every time. When you can't trust anything else, you trust the bubble." I don't know why I thought of it that night. I just knew that the level was sitting in my shop where the process server had set the lawsuit on top of it, and something about that felt like a message I couldn't read yet. To understand how much this betrayal cut, you have to understand what came before it, the whole long ledger of a life I'd handed over without ever once asking for it back. I was the one who stayed. That's the simplest way to put it. When Mom died, Ryan flew in for the funeral, hugged me hard at the graveside, told me he loved me, and flew back to Arizona 40 hours later because he had a big deal closing. Ryan sold commercial real estate. He was good at it, or good enough at it, and he lived in a stucco house with a pool and a wife named Sharon who never quite looked at me straight, and 2 kids I'd met maybe 5 times. When Dad's tremor started, just his right hand, at first, a little flutter he tried to hide by keeping it in his pocket, I was the one who noticed. I was the one who took him to the neurologist. I was the one in the room when the word Parkinson's got said out loud, and I watched my father, a man who had built half the staircases in our county with those hands, look down at the hand that was going to betray him and go very, very still. I called Ryan that night. I said, "Dad's sick. It's serious. It's going to get worse." And Ryan said all the right words. "Oh no, oh God, what can I do? Keep me posted." And then the keeping posted became a monthly phone call, then a text, then nothing much at all. When I finally asked him, directly, 2 years in, whether he could come help even for a week so I could catch my breath, he told me it was just a really tough time for the business right now and offered to send money instead. He never sent the money, but he offered, and I think in his mind the offer counted. So I stayed. I moved back into my childhood bedroom for the last stretch, when Dad couldn't be left overnight, and I brought Lily with me, and my daughter did her homework at the same kitchen table where I'd done mine, while I spooned soup into my father's mouth in the next room. I held his hand when he could no longer squeeze back. I was there at 4:11 in the morning on a Wednesday in March when he took a breath and simply didn't take another. I closed his eyes. I called the funeral home. And then I called my brother and I heard him cry on the phone, and I forgave him everything in that moment, every absent year, because grief does that. Grief makes you generous. Ryan flew in for the funeral. He gave a beautiful eulogy. People came up to him afterward and said what a wonderful son he'd been, and I stood there in my black dress with my raw hands and said nothing, because that's not the kind of thing you correct at a funeral. And here is where she comes into the story. Rebecca Vance. Becca. I first heard her name in that text from Ryan, but I first understood what she was maybe a week later, when I did what anyone would do and I looked her up. Her website called her a certified estate legacy consultant and a grief-to-growth financial strategist. There were photographs of her in cream-colored blazers, standing in front of bookshelves that I would later learn were a stock backdrop, smiling the smile of someone who has practiced it. There were testimonials, all first name only. There was a lot of language about protecting your family's legacy and ensuring your loved one's true wishes are honored, and almost nothing, when you looked closely, about what she actually did or what she was actually licensed to do. That was the first thing that snagged. The credentials. Certified estate legacy consultant is not a thing. I didn't know that for a fact yet, but the carpenter in me knows the difference between a real joint and a piece of trim glued over a gap to hide it, and every line of that website felt like trim over a gap. She listed a certification from an institute whose website was 1 page long. She claimed 12 years of experience, but the earliest thing I could find with her name on it was 3 years old. The second thing that snagged was subtler, and it took me longer to name. It was the way she had positioned herself between Ryan and me. All communication should go through my representative. She had made herself the wall. My brother and I had our disagreements over the years, sure, but we had never in our lives needed a wall between us, and now suddenly there was one, and she was it, and she had built it fast. Every time I tried to reach Ryan directly in those first weeks, I got the same flat non-answer, and every time it had her fingerprints on it. I remember sitting in my workshop one evening after everyone had gone home, the sawdust hanging gold in the last of the light, turning my father's brass level over and over in my hands. I set it on the workbench and watched the little bubble drift towards center and settle. Level. True. And I heard his voice as clear as if he were standing at the bench beside me. The bubble tells you the truth every time. Something about Becca Vance was not level. I couldn't have proven it that night, but I knew it the way I know when a board is going to warp before it warps, a feeling in the hands, a wrongness you can't yet see. I just didn't know yet how far out of true the whole thing really was. The turning point came, as important things often do in my line of work, in the middle of a repair. About 3 weeks after I was served, my brother's lawyers sent over a demand, an inventory of every item I had removed from our parents' house, with an appraisal. It was meant to intimidate me, and it worked a little. but it also gave me a reason to do something I'd been avoiding. Among the things I'd taken home from Dad's house was his desk. A big oak partner's desk he'd built himself in 1979, the year I was born, the year he liked to say he built two things that lasted. I'd had it in my workshop for months, meaning to restore it, never able to make myself start. Now I had to appraise it, which meant I had to really look at it. So one Saturday I put on my apron and I started. The desk had a bad drawer, the bottom right one, which had never run smooth in my whole life. Dad used to shove it with his hip to close it. When I pulled it all the way out to fix the runner, I found the reason it stuck. There was a false back, a thin panel of oak set about 2 inches forward of the true back of the cabinet, and behind that panel there was a gap. My father had built a hidden compartment into his own desk and never told a living soul. I want you to understand what it's like to find something like that in a piece your father made with his hands. It's not just discovery. It's like hearing his voice. I sat down on the sawdust floor with that drawer in my lap, and I pried the false panel loose with a putty knife, gentle as I could, and inside the gap there was a flat metal box, the kind that used to hold cassette tapes, wrapped in a chamois cloth. Inside the box were 2 things. The first was a letter handwritten in my father's shaky late-stage script. It was dated 4 months before he died. It was addressed to both of us, to my children, Ryan and Emma. And it said, in his own words, in his own broken handwriting, exactly what he had wanted and why. It said that he had changed the trust deliberately, in his right mind, because Emma had given up her business and her life to care for him and Ryan had given up nothing. It said he loved us both. It said he knew this might cause trouble and he was sorry, and that he wanted Ryan to understand it was not a punishment but a recognition of the truth. Emma was here, he wrote. That is not manipulation. That is love, and love should be honored, not lawyered. I read it 11 times. I'm not ashamed to say I sobbed on my own workshop floor with sawdust sticking to my wet face. The second thing in the box was a folded document, and it took me a minute to understand what I was looking at because it wasn't about our family at all. It was a printout, a page from a state court records site, and the name at the top of it, highlighted in my father's yellow marker, was Rebecca A. Vance. My father had known about her, before he died. He had somehow known. I couldn't do this alone, and I knew it. A hidden letter and a highlighted printout were not going to win a lawsuit by themselves. I'd watched enough of the world to know that the truth doesn't defend itself, that somebody has to carry it into the room. So I did the thing I'd been putting off because I couldn't imagine affording it. I hired a lawyer. Her name was Karen Mitchell. She was maybe 60, gray hair cut sensible, an office over a dry cleaner that smelled faintly of steam, and hands that had clearly done real work at some point in her life before they did this. I liked her the moment she looked at my father's brass level. I'd brought it with me. I don't fully know why, maybe for courage. And instead of asking why I'd brought a tool to a law office, she picked it up, sighted along it, set it down, and said, "Your dad's." Yeah. He'd want you to fight this properly then. No half measures. I showed her the letter. She read it once, slow, and when she finished, she took her glasses off and pressed the bridge of her nose and said something I'll never forget. She said, "Emma, in 31 years of doing this, I have almost never seen a piece of evidence this clean. A contemporaneous, handwritten statement of intent from the settlor, dated, unprompted, hidden where no one could pressure him to write it. This isn't a defense. This is a wall your brother's lawyers are going to run straight into." Then I showed her the printout, the one about Becca Vance. Karen went very still. She read it, and then she reached into her desk and pulled out a legal pad, and she said, "Tell me everything you know about this woman, every single thing, because your father didn't just leave you a letter, Emma. Your father left you a lead." The printout was a record of a civil case in another state, 3 years old, a wrongful conduct suit against Rebecca Vance by the family of an elderly widower. It had settled quietly, but it existed. And with a name and a case number, Karen could pull the thread, and Karen knew people, and one of the people Karen knew was a woman named Susan Delgado, whose father had been the widower in that lawsuit. Karen and I confronted Ryan for the first time not in a courtroom, but in a conference room, a mandatory mediation session before trial. Ryan came with Becca Vance at his side and a young lawyer who clearly worked for her more than for him. That was the first time I saw her in person. Cream blazer, exactly like the website. The practiced smile. And I watched the way she touched my brother's arm to answer for him when the mediator asked him a question, the way she leaned in and murmured before he spoke, and I saw the wall in 3 dimensions. She wasn't his consultant. She was his handler. Karen slid one single sheet of paper across the table. It was a copy of Dad's letter. I watched my brother read our father's handwriting. I watched his face, my brother's face, the face I'd known my entire life, begin to crack down the middle. And I watched Becca Vance's hand come down on the paper, flat, covering it, and heard her say, smooth as varnish, "This is an obvious fabrication. Anyone could forge a shaky signature. We'll be requesting a handwriting analysis, and I'd be very careful, MS. Mitchell, about introducing forged documents into evidence. Forged, she'd looked at my dead father's last honest words and called them a forgery without a flicker. Ryan didn't say anything, but he didn't look at me either. He looked at her hand on the paper, and something moved behind his eyes that I hadn't seen there before. Doubt. The first small crack of it. After she called the letter a forgery, Becca Vance got desperate, and desperate people get sloppy. The handwriting analysis she demanded came back, from an independent, court-appointed examiner, as a conclusive match to my father's known writing samples. Not a forgery. Authentic beyond dispute. She'd gambled that a challenge would scare us off, and instead she'd handed us a forensic confirmation that the letter was real. When Karen told me the result over the phone, I sat down on my workshop floor again in the same spot, and I laughed until I cried. But she didn't stop. She escalated. She had Ryan file additional claims that I'd mishandled Dad's medications, that I'd isolated him from his son, the exact accusations that were true of her relationship with Ryan, flipped and aimed at me. It was a nasty thing to read about yourself. And the cruelest part was seeing Ryan's name on it, knowing she was drafting the words and my brother was signing them. Meanwhile, Karen and I built the other case, the one about Becca. Susan Delgado agreed to talk to us. We drove out to meet her, a woman about my age, tired around the eyes in a way I recognized, the specific tiredness of someone who has buried a parent and then had to defend the burying. She told us her story, and it was mine in a different key. Her father, a widower with money and grief and loneliness, had met Becca Vance at a legacy planning seminar at his church. Becca had positioned herself between him and his children exactly the way she'd positioned herself between Ryan and me. She'd steered his estate, taken fees that were never fully explained, and by the time the family understood what was happening, a great deal was gone. They'd sued. She'd settled to make it quiet, and part of the settlement was a non-disclosure agreement. But there's no NDA that stops me from testifying under subpoena, Susan said, and she smiled a hard little smile. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask. There was more. With Susan's help and Karen's subpoenas, we established that Rebecca Vance held no license of any kind, not as a financial advisor, not as an attorney, not as a fiduciary. The certified estate legacy consultant credential was, as I'd suspected on day one, decorative. She was operating a business that required licensure in our state without any of it, and there was a pattern. At least 3 grieving families, always the same method, always a widower or a distant sibling, always the wall she built and stood inside. Karen assembled it all into a single sealed exhibit. She wouldn't tell me exactly how she planned to use it. There's a right moment, she said, and it isn't in a pretrial motion. I want it to land where it counts on the record in front of the judge at trial. You trust me. I thought about my father and the bubble and the truth that shows itself when you can finally see it. I thought about the little brass level sitting on Karen's desk where I'd left it for luck. I trust you, I said. The second confrontation came right before trial. Karen and I met with Ryan again, and this time Becca wasn't there, because Karen had specifically requested Ryan attend alone, and to my shock, he had. He looked terrible. Thinner. Older. He sat across the table, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, 30 years of being brother and sister sitting between us like a third person in the room. Then Karen laid out the sworn statement from Susan Delgado and the licensing records and the pattern. She laid it out flat and quiet, no drama, just the truth on paper. And I watched my brother read it. I watched him understand, page by page, that the woman he'd let build a wall between him and his only sister was a con artist working her fourth family, and that the manipulator she'd been warning him about had been at their father's bedside at 4:11 in the morning while he was 2,000 miles away. He looked up at me. His eyes were wet. And he opened his mouth to say something, I don't know what, an apology, a defense, I'll never know, and Karen said, gently, don't, not yet, say it in the right place. And she put everything back in the folder, and she sealed it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I don't know why, but I'd built it up in my mind as one of those grand marble rooms you see on television, and instead it was a plain municipal courtroom with fluorescent lights and carpet the color of weak coffee and a radiator that clanked twice during the proceedings like it had an opinion. But the smallness of the room didn't make it less serious. If anything, it made it more so, because there was nowhere for the truth to hide in a room that size. Everyone could see everyone. That mattered later. I sat at the defense table beside Karen Mitchell in the one good blazer I owned, a navy thing I'd bought years ago for a client meeting that never happened. My hands were folded in my lap, and inside my folded hands I was holding my father's brass level. I'd asked Karen if I could bring it. She'd said, "Is it going to distract you?" And I'd said, "No, it's going to steady me." And she'd nodded like that was the most reasonable thing anyone had ever told her, and she'd let me keep it. Across the aisle sat my brother, and beside him sat Rebecca Vance, cream blazer, hands folded, smile at half power, dialed down to solemn for the occasion. Her lawyer sat on her other side. And I noticed everyone in that room would come to notice that Becca sat between Ryan and the aisle. Between Ryan and me, even here, even now, she could not stop building the wall. The judge was a woman named Judge Amanda Reyes, gray-suited, unhurried, with reading glasses she took on and off like punctuation. She had read the filings. She had read the motions. When she looked out over that little room, she looked like a woman who had seen a great many families do a great many unforgivable things to each other over money, and who was tired of it in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Ryan's side went first. His lawyer stood and made the case that our father had been vulnerable, isolated, dependent, and that I, the daughter who lived with him, cared for him, controlled his medications and his calendar and his access to the world, had used that dependence to turn him against his son and rewrite the trust in my favor. It was a clean argument. On paper, without the letter, without the desk, it might even have worked. I sat and listened to a stranger describe the worst 4 years of my life, the years I gave away freely and gladly, and call them a slow, patient theft. I felt Karen's hand come to rest on my forearm, steadying, and I held the brass level tighter, and I did not react because Karen had told me, "Whatever they say, you sit still. Let them talk. Truth is patient." Then it was our turn. Karen stood. She is not a dramatic woman. I want you to understand that, because what happened next was not theater, it was the opposite of theater. It was a very plain woman putting very plain truth in front of a judge one piece at a time. She entered the letter into evidence. My father's handwritten letter, dated, and beside it the court-appointed handwriting examiner's report confirming it was authentic beyond dispute. She read the letter aloud. She read my father's words in that clanking little room, and when she got to the line, "Emma was here." That is not manipulation. That is love, and love should be honored, not lawyered. I heard my brother make a sound. A small, broken sound, quickly swallowed. I didn't look at him. I looked at the bubble in the level in my hands, drifting, settling, level, true. Becca Vance's lawyer objected, argued, tried to muddy it. Judge Reyes let the letter stand. It was authentic. It was the settlor's own words. There is very little a court values more. And then Karen did the thing. She said, "Your Honor, before we rest, the defense would like to address the matter of undue influence directly, because there was, in fact, undue influence exercised in connection with this trust. Just not by my client." And she walked to the bench, and she handed the bailiff a sealed manila envelope, and the bailiff carried it to Judge Ray's. The room went quiet enough that I heard the radiator tick as it cooled. Inside that envelope was everything. Susan Delgado's sworn statement. The out of state civil case. The state licensing board's confirmation that Rebecca Vance held no license, no certification, no legal standing to do any of the work she'd been paid to do. The pattern 4 families, always a widower or an estranged sibling, always the wall. And on top of it all, the page my father had highlighted in yellow marker and hidden in the desk he built the year I was born. My father, in the last months of his failing life, had somehow found her out and left me a map. Judge Ray's read it. She read all of it, and it took a long time, and nobody in that room moved. I watched her face change the way a piece of wood changes when you plane away the finish and find the true grain underneath, slowly, and then all at once. When she finished, she took off her reading glasses and folded them and looked, not at me and not at Karen. She looked at Rebecca Vance. "Ms. Vance," she said, very quietly, "are you licensed to provide financial or fiduciary advisory services in this state?" Becca's smile flickered. "I'm a consultant, Your Honor. My role is—" "That's not what I asked. Are you licensed?" The silence stretched, and in that silence my brother turned in his chair and looked at the woman beside him, really looked at her, for what I think may have been the first time, and I watched the last of the spell break in his eyes. It didn't break loud. It broke quiet, the way ice breaks under you before you hear it. He stood up. In the middle of the proceedings, he stood up, and his lawyer reached for his sleeve, and Ryan pulled his arm away. And he said, to the judge, in a voice I hadn't heard from my brother since we were children, "Your Honor, I'd like to withdraw the lawsuit, all of it. Right now, His voice cracked. He tried again. "I was wrong. I was lied to, and I let myself be lied to because it was easier than admitting my sister did everything and I did nothing. I don't want a penny. I want to talk to my sister." Judge Ray's looked at him for a long moment over the top of her folded glasses. Then she looked back at Rebecca Vance, and whatever mercy was in that room, none of it went to Becca. "The petition is dismissed with prejudice," she said, "and MS. Vance, you're not leaving this building before you speak with someone. Bailiff." She turned to my side of the room, and for just a second, I might have imagined it, but I don't think I did. Her eyes went to the little brass tool in my hands, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Ms. Scott, I'm sorry for your loss. Your father sounds like he was a careful man." "He was a carpenter," I said. It was the only thing I could get out. "He measured everything twice." "It shows," she said, and she rose, and the room rose with her, and it was over. The undoing of Rebecca Vance was not one dramatic collapse but a slow, thorough dismantling, and I confess I took a quiet satisfaction in each piece of it. The materials in that sealed envelope didn't stay sealed. Judge Ray's, as it turned out, was required by law to report what she'd seen, and she did, to the state licensing authority and to the district attorney's office. The unlicensed practice was the least of it. Once investigators had a thread to pull, the pattern I'd found with Karen and Susan turned out to be only part of it. There were more families, more widowers, more grieving people who had trusted a woman in a cream blazer who told them she only wanted to protect their legacy. Charges followed: fraud, unlicensed practice, financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Susan Delgado testified, freed at last from the silence her family's settlement had bought. So did others. Becca Vance's practice was finished, her assets frozen and clawed back to make restitution, her name entered in the public record as exactly what she was. She would not be building any more walls between any more families. The last I heard, she was facing sentencing, and the cream blazers had been traded for something the county provides. But that's not the part of the ending I hold on to. The part I hold on to is my brother. Ryan and I didn't fall into each other's arms in that courtroom. I want to be honest with you, because I think the honest version is more useful than the movie version. Betrayal doesn't heal in a hallway. What happened was slower and quieter, and, I think, more real. He asked if we could talk. We went to a diner near the courthouse, the kind of place with laminated menus and burnt coffee, and we sat across from each other in a vinyl booth, two middle-aged people who used to build forts together, and for a while we didn't say much at all. Then Ryan said, "Tell me about the last 4 years. All of it. I never let you tell me. I didn't want to know because if I knew, I'd have to know what I wasn't doing." And I told him. The mornings, the pills. The 4:11 a.m. I told him about Dad calling out for Mom in the night. I told him about the ramp and the shower chair and the business I let shrink. I didn't say it to punish him. I said it because he asked, finally, and because our father's letter had said love should be honored, not lawyered, and honoring it meant telling the truth. Ryan cried into a paper napkin in a diner booth, and a man cries differently at 51 than at any other age, and I reached across the burnt coffee and I held my brother's hand. And it was the first time in years I hadn't been the one holding a hand that couldn't hold back. He came to my workshop the next week. He met Lily properly, his niece, who he barely knew and who eyed him warily until he asked her to show him how the lathe worked, and she decided he might be all right after all. He picked up the brass level off my bench and turned it over in his hands and said, "I remember when Dad gave you this." And I told him what Dad had said about the bubble, about how it tells the truth when nothing else will, and Ryan set it down very gently, and he looked at me and he said, "It was pointing at her the whole time, wasn't it?" And I said, "It was pointing at the truth. Same thing in the end." We're not the family we might have been if the last decade had gone differently. Some things don't come all the way back, but he calls now. Real calls, not obligation. He flew out and helped me finish restoring Dad's desk, the two of us, and we left the hidden compartment exactly as Dad built it, empty now, but there, a little secret space in the middle of the family, kept on purpose. As for me, I kept the workshop. I kept my daughter. I kept my father's honest name and my own. I kept the letter framed on the wall where I can see it while I work. And I kept the brass level on my bench where it sits to this day, a little bubble drifting towards center, settling, telling me the same thing my father told me 30 years ago and the same thing that courtroom finally proved. The bubble never lies. People do. But if you're patient, and if you're careful, and if you measure everything twice, the truth will show itself level and true.